Okay, welcome to this module on predictive modeling. It is the last module of HIED 654. In this lecture, we are going to hear from Bart Herridge, who's the Associate Dean of Student Services and the Director of Student Retention at Abilene Christian University. We're going to be discussing predictive modeling. I consider him one of the experts on this campus in predictive modeling, and he uses it a ton when talking about shaping the classes and working with our enrollment management team on picking the right students who will retain and building retention models. So Bart, thanks for taking time to join us during this lecture. Let's get started. Okay, so first, give us your definition of predictive modeling. How have you seen the practice evolve during your time? You've been in higher ed forever, but how have you seen it evolve during your time in higher ed?
So to start off with defining predictive modeling, it's really, there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but the simplest definition is using historical data to predict something. And generally speaking, that is enrollment or retention or some other dependent variable that you are trying to predict based on years of historical data that you put together. It can be as simple as I'm looking at a pivot table in Excel and this particular cell has retained at this rate for the last 5 years, so I'm predicting it's going to retain at that rate. Or it can be as complicated as just a regression that brings in all sorts of statistical models, and there are a number of kind of statistical models that we won't get into today.
Right.
About how to do that.
I think we all appreciate that.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways to do it, and there's a lot of different definitions of it, but at its simplest core, it is using your historical data to define and to try to predict future events.
Great.
So it's evolution. Predictive modeling in higher education, first of all, corporations and businesses have been doing this for 30 or 40 years.
Right.
Higher education was late to the game, and higher education first got into the predictive modeling business when it came to fundraising. So it really started with advancement and development offices looking at predictive data to determine who was going to be givers to an institution. And then the next evolution of that came along was the admissions office trying to get into the game, trying to better predict what parts of their primarily search buys, what students would respond favorably in a search buy using predictive data to try to analyze that. And now we're on the beginning part of the third wave of that, which is retention, using predictive data to determine who is likely to retain, who is not likely to retain, and then really looking at what intervention strategies for those things would be. So it has definitely evolved in terms of colleges' use of the tool, and it has the tool itself has evolved. So whereas 20 years ago you were using fairly standard, sometimes even linear regression techniques to try to predict classes, now you're seeing very complex variables. The retention model, for example, that we're using here looks at over 250 variables to try to predict retention, and is using a pretty complex logistic regression model to do that.
So give me an idea of some of the variables that are out there. I mean, there's 250 of them. Sure, you look at that. What are some variables that you use or that you have used, maybe in enrollment, maybe in retention, to predict behavior at ACU?
Okay, so a couple of interesting ones. The standard stuff always applies, and one of the things I talk about when I talk about predictive modeling to people is most of the stuff that you think is probably predictive is probably predictive, and those variables might give you 60 or 70% of the strength of a model. So, for example, I'll use ACU. We are a primarily Church of Christ, have been historically. We're out of the Church of Christ tradition. And when I was in admissions here back in the early 90s, and then when I returned in 2000, we were still fairly heavily Church of Christ oriented in terms of our recruiting populations. That's changed in the last 14 years, but at that time that was still the case. And so a student who was Church of Christ was very likely to enroll at ACU just by virtue of being Church of Christ. So the variables that you think are probably likely are probably likely. Where predictive modeling gives you an advantage over the eyeball test is it gives you that last 30%. It pulls some variables to the surface that will distinguish between two students who otherwise look identical in your data model.
Okay.
And I'll give you a great example of that. So back in when we first started doing predictive modeling in admissions, it was 2000, 2001. And one of the variables that popped up as being predictive for our admissions, for our enrollment, so students that were likely to come to the university as first-time freshmen, was home value, and it was actually on a bell curve. So students who had very low home value were not likely to enroll, and students with very high home value were not likely to enroll. It was a group of students whose parents had home values that were basically in the middle. And we began really looking at that and diving into it, and actually interviewed a group of students coming out of that process, and talking to parents, sort of began to get this picture of a parent who, hey, we're not going to upgrade our house because we want to afford to send our kids to private Christian education.
Right.
And so they were making some personal sacrifice. You're not going to get that anywhere else.
Right.
You're not going to get that kind of data anywhere else in terms of the analysis that you're doing out of data that you have. Another example from the retention modeling that we're doing now. So ACU is an institution that has chapel. We have chapel 5 days a week. We have we call Big Chapel in our large Coliseum in Moody 3 days a week, and then we have a lot of small group chapels across campus. And so what we know from our retention data is students who get most of their chapel credits, a majority, over half of their chapel credits in small group chapels, are more likely to retain than students who get most of their credit from just sitting in Moody. And that makes sense because small group build community. I'm engaged. I'm attached to other people. So logically, it makes sense, but it also makes sense from a data perspective.
Right. That's interesting because we've talked about even through these first year courses how community is so important in the selling of the institution and the retaining of students.
Absolutely.
Even at a small school level. But then we think about, what about schools like Baylor? What about schools like UT? What about schools like University of North Carolina? They're just enormous schools that the concept is still the same.
Right.
Is that you've got to find your community, and that's what they're selling. Is they're selling the big school experience, but they're also selling these tiny communities in that piece too. So it's universal. It's just on a different scale.
It is, and I think for a lot of institutions, particularly the larger, the what we think of flagship state institutions or the large private institutions, part of what they're trying to do is to help you find a place pretty quickly.
Right.
So they'll do things that will trigger that. So they have lots of activity fairs on campus to try to get you engaged in activities. They're trying to get you to pledge in your first semester. They're trying to get you into a fraternity or sorority in your first semester so that you've got a group of people that you're attached to. All sorts of things like that those institutions are doing to try to drag people into community as early as possible.
That's great. Okay, so in this module, we're not building a predictive model. We don't prescribe to being completely data heads, and we know how the models work. But can you talk to us about the basic structure of a model? Are there super complex models? Are there super simple models? And where do you see? I would lean toward the don't overcomplicate things, but you also want the best data.
Yeah.
So agree with me, contradict me, talk to me about models.
So I've done a fair amount of consulting on predictive modeling for a lot of different institutions, and the first rule of thumb on this is you only want to engage in the level of data that you can manage. So one of the first rules in predictive modeling is it's a concept called longitudinality of data. And that basically means we're going to use the data to predict the future, essentially, but we're only going to use the data that we have at the point in time that we need to make a prediction. And that's one of the very difficult things for a lot of schools to get their heads around. So, as an example, if I'm trying to predict which students are going to be admitted to my institution, I can't use data that occurs after their admission. Because I don't have that data at the point in time when I'm using data to make a decision. So So there's a lot of concepts that you kind of need to understand about predictive modeling going into it. But in general, if an institution can bite off, hey, we're going to do full-on logistic regression, logit, probit, one of the different methodologies of doing that, and we can look at 250 or 300 variables, great, do that. If you can't do that, and the best you can do is come up with a pivot table that gives you 5 years of data that shows academic quality and financial need on your X and Y axis, and that's the best you've got, do that. Because that's really, you need to do what you can manage as an institution. And particularly for a lot of small institutions, if you're bringing in a freshman class of less than 500 students, it's really difficult to get enough historical data to build a good predictive model.
Right.
Because then you have to go back, just to get raw numbers that are large enough, you have to go back 5 and 6 years. And in the recruiting game, nothing looks the same as it did 5 years ago.
Right.
Everything is different every 5 years. And so it's hard
almost every year.
Almost every year in some ways, yeah. So it's hard to build a data set that's really robust enough to use in that level. So the structure of the model, there's a lot of statistical principles that we can get into. I am not a statistician. I'll be the first one to tell you I don't build my own models. I sort of oversee and help guide that process a little bit. But there's a lot of different ways to do it. The structure, I guess, is getting back to your original question. So you're always looking at a dependent variable. And the dependent variable is, what is it that I'm trying to predict? What is it that I'm trying to measure student behavior toward? So if you're in admissions, my dependent variable is almost always who is going to enroll. Right? In retention, it's who's going to retain to what point X.
Right.
So
it's not always graduation either.
No, in fact, the ones that we use here, we're primarily trying to identify students that are going to retain to first semester of their sophomore year. We're actually in the process right now of working on a graduation model that's going to look at students who are going from sophomore year to graduation and kind of see how that plays out. So we're using graduation as the dependent variable on that. All of the other variables are then labeled as independent variables, and they may or may not be predictive.
Right.
So the person who's building your model will use, again, the statistical methodology to go through and decide if these variables are predictive. If they're predictive, they go in the model. If they're not predictive, they're thrown out. And so you end up with a model, sometimes you'll have one that's as small as 5 or 6 variables, and it's pretty simple that you could build in Excel. And then sometimes you'll have something that's as complicated as 200 variables, where certain variables may be combined with other variables. So this variable by itself is not necessarily predictive, and this variable by itself is not very predictive, but together, measured together, they become a highly predictive variable. And so that's the advantage of doing real logistic regression, is you get an opportunity to look at how your variables are interacting with each other in a way that you don't if you're just building something in Excel in a pivot table. Having said that, if you need to do the pivot table, do the pivot table. If that's the way you need to get started in this process, that's absolutely the best way to get started in this process, because it will really help you understand what your data looks like and essentially what it is that you're looking for.
Okay. So how is accuracy determined when you look at predictive models? What are the steps you take, or what are the steps the universities take to make sure that their predictive model was successful, was unsuccessful? Do you just look at the numbers that come in?
So
what's the...
Are you asking before you're using the model, or maybe after?
Probably both.
Okay. So before, you're really looking at... So I'm going to give you a mathematician's answer, which is really not the right answer, but it's the mathematician's answer. And the mathematician's answer is the data is correct. So when you build a model that's built on historical data, assuming that the inputs are the same,
right,
the model's going to be correct.
Right.
So the interesting facet of applying predictive modeling in a higher education setting is every year looks a little different. And anybody who's worked college admissions at any point in time, and anybody who's worked retention will tell you every class is a little bit different. Every freshman class that we bring in is a little bit different. this is one of the areas that I talk to the development people sometimes that do predictive modeling, and they're at such a huge advantage because they're dealing with the same pools of people year after year after year, and their pools don't really change, and there's not a start and stop, so we don't kick all these people out of the pool in a year because they're still eligible donors for us. They have such huge advantages using this process. For us doing work with students on a cohort year basis, man, it's just different. Last year's class is different than this year's class. Even though it looks pretty similar, there might be significant enough data differences that something doesn't come in exactly like the models show. Well, we had a higher increase this year of minority students, and that the minority students retained like we thought they would, but there were more of them, and therefore our numbers look different than they did in the previous year. So each cohort is different. Quick aside. So one of the things I tell people, if you're ever involved in retention work, one of your primary jobs as a retention officer at a university is to be predicting your own retention rates every year. Because the tendency of your administration is going to think, okay, you did 79 last year, so you can do 80 this year. And every cohort is different. And you can't build on them in the same way that you might be able to other things that can grow over time. So you have to be predicting your own cohort. Otherwise, you're letting people set your goals for you.
So it's like flipping a coin. You would think if I flip 4 heads in a row, I should flip a tails here. Except it's 50-50, and every coin flips the same.
Every single time.
Right. And the same with your cohorts.
So the sequence as a whole, there's a probability and a likelihood of coming up with a sequence as a whole.
Sure.
But every individual coin flip and every individual cohort year has a different flavor to it and a different nature to it. That means it is completely independent of the coin flips and the cohort years before.
Like it.
Absolutely. So, getting back to your original question on that. So for accuracy, if the inputs come in, the model's going to be fairly accurate. After the fact, how we measure it is, again, we look at the data based on how did we do in the pockets that we measured. And by pockets, I'm talking about individual data groups. So the model predicted us that we were going to be at 78% freshman and sophomore retention. Overall, we were at 79.4, and how did we do within the certain segments that we're interested in looking at? Minority students, males, females, athletes, how did we do in all those different pockets, and how did the model actually predict? So that's a fairly easy piece to come back to measure it.
Right.
I'm going to use one of my sort of cliche lines right now that you'll probably hear me say 2 or 3 more times before we finish in this. It's just data, it's not life.
Right.
And so what I mean by that is you have students, and I'm thinking about this from a retention perspective specifically. So you have students that look like they should retain. We have students every year who were predicted to retain in the 90th percentile. They are 90% likely to retain, and they leave our institution because life happens,
right?
And because life cannot be predicted accurately by data 100% of the time. They leave because they weren't emotionally ready to be at college. They leave because mom got cancer and they need to be closer to home. They leave because their sister got pregnant and they need to be at home to help. All of those things happen and they are not predictable. And so what the data is trying to point you to is what are the groups that are most likely, to do the thing it is that you're trying to predict, to enroll, to retain, whatever that is. That's going to help you because right now we have a freshman class of 1,000 every year at ACU. If you're telling me which one of those to go retain 800 of those 1,000 students, I have no idea where to start. And by the way, I'm one person. I have a couple of people that work for me, but in general, it's a small staff. I have no idea where to start with that process. What the modeling process helps me to do is to identify the 150 that are most likely to leave and focus on that group instead of having to focus on 1,000.
Okay. So, would you say that predictive modeling, predictive analytics are used more for understanding or more for action?
That's a good question. I've seen a lot of different institutions that are using analytics simply for the understanding piece of it and almost after the fact reporting. We I mean, it needs to be used for action.
Right.
And I would say there's a lot of ways to do reporting without doing predictive analytics, but the purpose for it ultimately is about action. And I also tell people models are only as good as the intervention strategies that are used to affect them. So you can have a fantastic model that predicts a retention rate, and you can watch that all year, and you can watch yourself hit a retention rate, and if you didn't do anything with that, what good was it? Right. So the key piece of this really comes down to, hey, building the model is fantastic, and that's going to help you, and it's going to help you identify a group of people to go after, but then you have to figure out what the right intervention strategies are to go after the group that you're interested in. And those intervention strategies can be, there's a lot of different things that you can do, both from an admissions perspective and a retention perspective in terms of how to do that. But those strategies are what's crucial to this, and the strategies ultimately are what's going to drive improvement. The model itself is not going to drive improvement. Again, it's just data. It's not real life.
Okay. So, last question is, if you were mentoring a group of enrollment professionals, what's the best advice you could give them in regards to predictive modeling enrollment?
So, I guess I'd throw in what I said a while ago, particularly to those professionals that are in retention, is to say, be predicting your own goals, be using modeling to predict what your own retention rates are going to be, and begin educating administrators about the difference between each cohort, and be educating your admissions folks about the difference between each cohort so that they have an understanding of the different classes that they're bringing in. On the admissions side of the equation, I would say we've seen the growth in use of predictive analytics in admissions over the last 10 years. It's just exploded. Now there are companies and services all over the place that are doing this kind of work everywhere. So if you're not doing this, your competitors almost certainly are.
Right.
And they are figuring something out that you may not know. So I would advocate that every school needs to be doing this at some level. Right. And where your size or your resources or those things don't allow you to do something robust, do something simple.
Right.
Do something small.
Just do something.
Just do something. Do something to allow you to segment and target. This comes back to, I've taught marketing off and on over the years. And this really comes back to marketing 101. This is, segmentation of your population, and then specifically get into what are your strategies for that particular segment? How do you deal with that segment to try to move them towards enrolling or retaining?
Well, this has been very, very helpful. Thank you for spending some time with us. And